The first flower I saw looked like a human hand clawing its way out of the dirt. Its blackened petals curled into thin fingers that pointed directly toward me beneath the pale moonlight. I remember standing frozen beside the grave, while cold rain dripped from the trees and something deep beneath the earth made a sound like distant breathing. The cemetery should have been abandoned for decades, according to everyone in town. Broken headstones leaned at crooked angles among dead weeds, and most of the graves had become impossible to read beneath moss and cracked stone. Yet in the center of that forgotten place sat one grave covered in fresh flowers that looked as though they had been placed there only hours earlier. By morning, every flower had withered into strange, twisted shapes. One resembled a screaming face with hollow eyes, while another formed what looked disturbingly close to a warning arrow, pointing toward the woods behind the cemetery. I wish I had walked away then, because the final flower bent itself into the exact shape of my initials, and that was the moment I realized the grave somehow knew who I was. I moved to Black Hollow after my divorce, because I wanted silence more than anything else. The town sat between endless forests and crumbling hills, where fog rolled through the streets every evening like smoke from an invisible fire. Most people avoided speaking to outsiders, and nearly everyone crossed themselves whenever the old cemetery was mentioned aloud. The graveyard stood behind an abandoned church at the edge of town. Locals claimed the place had been cursed since the 1950s, after several disappearances connected to a woman buried there under suspicious circumstances. Nobody agreed on her name, but everyone agreed flowers left on her grave never stayed normal for long. I first heard the story from an old cashier at the grocery store during a thunderstorm. She noticed the mud on my boots and immediately asked whether I had visited the cemetery road beyond the woods. When I admitted I had, her face lost all color, and she quietly told me never to return after dark unless I wanted the dead learning my name. Of course, I returned the very next night, because curiosity has always been my worst flaw. I brought a flashlight, my camera, and a fresh bouquet of white lilies that I bought from a roadside stand outside town. The air around the grave felt colder than the rest of the cemetery, and every sound seemed muffled, as though the earth itself were listening. I placed the flowers gently against the cracked headstone before stepping back to take photographs. The grave had no visible name carved into it anymore, because deep scratches covered most of the surface, like someone had tried desperately to erase the identity beneath. Then I noticed fresh claw marks in the mud surrounding the grave, despite the heavy rain washing everything else away. The whisper came from directly behind me, even though nobody stood there. A woman's voice softly repeated my name, while something brushed against the back of my jacket like damp fingers. When I turned around, the flowers had already begun wilting before my eyes. The petals folded inward slowly, like dying insects curling into themselves. Within seconds, the lilies transformed into a shape resembling a kneeling woman with her mouth stretched open in terror. I stumbled backward into the mud, while my flashlight flickered violently, and the church bell suddenly rang somewhere in the darkness, despite the church having no power. I barely slept after that night, because the whispering followed me home. Every creak inside my rented house sounded like footsteps dragging through wet soil, and I kept waking to the smell of rotting flowers filling my bedroom. The worst part was hearing soft crying beneath my floorboards shortly before dawn each morning. 3 days later, I visited the local library searching for records about the grave. Most documents connected to the cemetery had disappeared, but an elderly archivist reluctantly showed me newspaper clippings hidden inside an unmarked folder. The articles described a woman accused of practicing rituals involving mourning flowers and communication with the dead before she vanished during a town-wide fire. No body was ever officially recovered according to the reports. Despite that fact, townspeople built a grave anyway, because witnesses claimed they heard screaming beneath the cemetery soil for weeks after the fire ended. Several residents later disappeared after leaving flowers there, and the town eventually sealed the church grounds permanently. That night, I discovered dirt scattered across my bedroom floor beside my bed. Dead flower petals formed a spiral leading toward the closet, even though every window remained locked from the inside. When I opened the closet door, I found muddy fingerprints smeared across the back wall, alongside a single sentence scratched into the paint that read, "She is still beneath us." I should have left Black Hollow immediately after finding that message. Instead, I became obsessed with understanding what truly rested beneath the cemetery, because every strange event seemed connected to something larger waiting in the dark. Fear slowly turned into fascination, and fascination became the thing that nearly destroyed me. The deeper I investigated, the stranger the town became around me. People avoided eye contact whenever I mentioned the cemetery, and one old man physically grabbed my arm outside a diner before warning me that grief itself could become a doorway if enough people fed it for long enough. His hands trembled violently while he spoke, as though he had once seen something impossible beneath the graves. I eventually uncovered hidden maps showing tunnels beneath the abandoned church. The passages connected to burial chambers older than the town itself, and strange symbols had been drawn repeatedly around one specific underground room directly beneath the mysterious grave. Every symbol resembled flowers twisting around a wide-open eye. Around that point, I genuinely did not know what to do anymore. If you had uncovered evidence suggesting something alive existed beneath an abandoned cemetery, would you have kept investigating or run as far away as possible before it noticed you too? I wish now that someone had forced me to walk away, because what happened next still follows me every single night. I entered the catacombs shortly after midnight, carrying only a lantern and my camera. The tunnels smelled like wet stone and decayed flowers, and thousands of dried petals covered the walls in unnatural patterns that resembled human faces, screaming silently in the dark. Some petals were fresh despite the air underground being completely still and freezing cold. Deep beneath the church, I found a hidden chamber filled with bouquets arranged in circles across the floor. Every flower had withered into symbols and warnings that covered nearly every surface around me, like messages left by desperate victims. In the center of the chamber stood an empty coffin, surrounded by black soil that appeared freshly disturbed. Then I heard movement below the dirt beneath my feet. Something massive shifted underground with a slow grinding sound while the flowers along the walls began collapsing one by one into shapes resembling terrified faces. My lantern dimmed suddenly, and a woman's voice whispered directly beside my ear that the grave had never been meant to keep the thing buried. The earth erupted seconds later. Rotten roots and black soil exploded upward as a towering figure dragged itself from the pit with movements that looked horribly wrong for anything human. Its body resembled tangled branches wrapped around corpses, and hundreds of dead flowers bloomed from inside its chest, like organs pulsing beneath translucent skin. I realized then that the flowers had never been curses. They were warnings left by the dead after encountering the creature beneath the cemetery because it fed on grief, mourning, and human sorrow. Every bouquet placed upon the grave became twisted into desperate messages from trapped souls trying unsuccessfully to warn the living away. The entity spoke using dozens of overlapping voices belonging to missing townspeople. Some voices begged for help, while others laughed hysterically beneath the sound of cracking bones and shifting roots. Then it spoke in my ex-wife's voice, despite her being hundreds of miles away, and hearing that familiar voice from the creature nearly shattered my mind completely. I ran through the tunnels while the walls around me shook violently. Flowers burst from cracks in the stone and instantly withered into arrows pointing toward hidden exits as though the trapped spirits were guiding me away from the creature below. Behind me, I could hear the entity dragging itself through the catacombs while whispering my name over and over again. The tunnel collapsed moments after I escaped into the cemetery. Black roots burst from the ground around the graves, while screams echoed beneath the soil across the entire churchyard. I watched dozens of flowers, scattered across old graves, shrivel simultaneously into the shape of terrified human eyes staring directly at me. Authorities blamed the destruction on old tunnels collapsing after heavy rain. Nobody believed my story because there was no evidence left beneath the church except dirt, broken stone, and thousands of dead petals covering the ruins. Even I started questioning my sanity until the nightmares began returning every single night. Months passed before I noticed the first sign that the nightmare had not ended. Newspapers across nearby towns reported strange graves where flowers mysteriously withered into symbols and warnings overnight. Every location matched places connected to recent disappearances involving grieving families. I eventually left Black Hollow, but the whispers followed me everywhere I went. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night hearing soft crying beneath my apartment floor, and occasionally I find dead petals arranged into strange shapes outside my front door. No matter how far I travel, the smell of rotting flowers always returns eventually. Last week, I received a bouquet with no sender name attached. Every flower inside had already withered into letters, forming a single sentence that made my blood turn cold the moment I read it. The message simply said, "Your grave is waiting." If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Grave Nova Stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you in the next nightmare.